In the heart of Western Australia's most idyllic suburb, a nightmare unfolded that would haunt the nation for decades. The Claremont killer, once a trusted technician and community volunteer, hid behind a façade so ordinary, even his closest companions never suspected the horror he carried within. But as young women began vanishing without a trace, the truth slowly unraveled. A quiet man named Bradley Robert Edwards was living a double life. With over 1,000 pieces of evidence and hundreds of witnesses, his trial became one of Australia's most extensive and expensive in history. So who was this man behind the mask? And how did justice finally catch up to him? Let's dive into the chilling timeline of the Claremont serial killings and uncover how a community's worst fears turned into reality. The city of Claremont is currently facing a crisis due to a serial killer, targeting women, causing fear even among local street dogs. A man around 50 years old and noticeably out of shape entered the courtroom. Despite the passage of time, one trait remained unchanged: his ability to conceal his emotions. His name is Bradley Robert Edwards, yet people preferred his nickname in the newspapers, the Claremont Killer. Claremont is a wealthy suburb of Perth, the capital of Western Australia. The community lived in fear after at least 3 girls vanished without a trace. In response to these disappearances, Edwards faced a 7-month trial in 2012. The trial involved around 240 witnesses and analysed over 1,000 pieces of evidence. According to the Australian justice system, this investigation was one of the most complex, extensive, costly, and protracted in the country's history. It not only revealed the horrific crimes committed against the victims, but also shed light on the background of the Claremont killer, helping to explain his twisted behavior. Bradley Robert Edwards was born on December 7, 1968, in Australia. Little is known about his childhood, but some sources indicate that he attended elementary school in a town called Nungar Dale during the 1970s. He later went to high school and eventually worked for a communications company until 2016. Edwards also served as a timekeeper for an organization that hosted children's track and field events. He was often considered strange by those around him, as he openly discussed disturbing fantasies. There were also rumors that he stole women's underwear from dryers in nearby homes. Even while living with his parents, some teenagers claimed he kept a collection of women's underwear at home. Over time, Edwards developed an interest in wearing women's clothing, although he identified as heterosexual. This may have been a fetish that led to a series of criminal and inappropriate actions toward women. In February 1988, when he was just over 19 years old, he committed his first known attack. The victim was an 18-year-old girl who was sleeping in her parents' house. She barely knew Edwards. Their previous interactions had been minimal. In fact, she was the sister of a young man who had attended high school with him. The girl woke up in the middle of the night and immediately sensed someone sitting next to her. At first, she thought it might be the guy she had celebrated All Saints' Day with just hours earlier. However, she quickly realized that wasn't the case. Before she could make a sound, Edwards covered her mouth with his hand. Trying to stay calm, the girl initially believed the intruder was her boyfriend, and that he had only silenced her to avoid waking her parents. Unfortunately, she was wrong. Edwards pulled her head back and tried to cover her face with a rag. In a desperate moment, the girl told him that she loved him, an unexpected statement that momentarily startled Edwards. The girl reached out to touch the face of the person lying next to her, only to be slapped. In that moment, she realized it wasn't her boyfriend. It was an intruder. Panicked, she fought back, scratching Edwards's skin, which caused him to pull away. He quickly got off the bed and stood near the entrance of the room wearing only a shirt. Realizing she was in danger, the girl began banging on the wall and screaming for her parents to wake up and help. Fortunately, her cries frightened Edwards, and he fled, leaving behind a shirt resembling a kimono and other evidence of his presence. This evidence later proved crucial in a major investigation. Years later, Edwards's life had changed significantly. He met a woman by chance at a music festival in northern Western Australia. After their meeting, she ended a strong relationship with her boyfriend to be with Edwards. Eventually, he moved in with her. The woman, whose name remains undisclosed, described their life together as ordinary and rural. They owned several dogs and a horse. Each day, Edwards would drive her to work in his van before starting his own job. Occasionally, they visited friends on a nearby farm for dinner or barbecues. Overall, their life appeared unremarkable. As time went on, they began to discuss marriage. Edwards was only 22 at the time, and it seemed the idea of marriage was mostly driven by his girlfriend, while he showed little enthusiasm for it. One day, she began questioning him about his intentions regarding marriage, which upset him. The following day, while working on a telephone connection at a local hospital, Edwards attacked a social worker. He approached her from behind and dragged her into a restroom. The victim fought back and managed to push him away. At that point, Edwards appeared to snap back to reality, standing silently beside her with a blank stare. Although she escaped, the psychological trauma of the attack had a lasting impact on her life. Later, after identifying the attacker as an employee of a local telecommunications company, the victim reported him to his superiors. Shockingly, instead of being fired, Edwards was eventually promoted. Although the promotion occurred some time later, it was clear his employer supported him. His boss described him as a good worker who had likely lost his temper due to personal problems. Edwards admitted his wrongdoing and promised to seek professional help. Despite this, he was convicted, but only of simple assault, a charge the victim strongly opposed. Up until February 1995, Edwards's assaults did not appear to involve sexual violence. They were acts of physical aggression and did not lead to severe consequences, but they left emotional scars on his victims. Meanwhile, his relationship with his common-law wife deteriorated. She later said the decline was due in part to Edwards spending more time on the computer than with her. He eventually became emotionally distant, which led to the end of their relationship. On the morning of February 12th, Edwards committed another attack. This time, he kidnapped a 17-year-old woman who was walking through a park in Claremont. Reports state that the victim had just left a nightclub and was heading to her friend's house when she entered a poorly lit path leading into the park. Edwards grabbed her from behind and forced her into his work van. He told her to stay quiet, but at times she was too terrified to move. As he placed her in the van, he covered her head with a canvas bag and bound her ankles with makeshift restraints before driving toward a cemetery. There, he acted out his violent fantasies. The girl was so shocked during the ordeal that she couldn't even scream. She was in utter disbelief that this was happening to her. When it was over, Edwards left her in the bushes and calmly drove away. Once she realized he was gone, the victim opened her eyes and ran to the nearest hospital for help. Almost a year later, on January 27, 1996, an 18-year-old secretary named Sarah Spires also went missing. She disappeared from a similar area after leaving a nightclub around 2:00 a.m. 6 minutes later, she attempted to call a taxi from a phone booth. Although Sarah lived in southern Perth with her older sister, she gave a different address when requesting the taxi. By the time the car arrived, she was nowhere to be found. Either she had already been abducted, or the driver didn't see her in the dark. Witnesses reported hearing loud screams on the night Sarah went missing in the area where she was believed to have been. They also noted seeing an unusual van parked nearby, but no significant leads were discovered. Sarah grew up in rural Western Australia, where her father, Don, worked primarily as a sheep shearer, a common occupation in the region. She attended boarding school in Perth and later took secretarial courses, eventually securing a job at a consulting company. Before her disappearance, she lived with her older sister, with whom she shared a close bond. Her family described her as cautious, making it all the more surprising that she chose to leave the nightclub alone. Around the same time, Sarah disappeared. Edwards's relationship with his girlfriend was nearing its end. She had started seeing another man and may have even fallen in love with him. Initially, they were just friends who occasionally spent time together, but their relationship quickly developed, prompting Edwards and his girlfriend to break up. They had shared responsibilities, including pets, a mortgage, and a car loan. A few months after their separation, Edwards's ex-girlfriend called to inform him that she was pregnant. It's unclear how he reacted to the news, as he showed no visible emotion. On June 9, 1996, another of Edwards's victims went missing. This occurred around the time he learned about his ex-girlfriend's pregnancy. The missing person was a 20-year-old nanny named Jane Rimmer. Before her disappearance, Jane had been out with friends starting at a hotel called The Beach, then moving to the Hotel Continental, and finally heading toward a nightclub. However, when they arrived, there was a long line at the entrance. Jane's friends decided to leave and called a taxi, but she chose to stay. The last known footage of Jane was captured by surveillance cameras at the Hotel Continental, where she was seen talking for several minutes to a dark-haired man who was facing away from the camera. Jane lived in an apartment in Perth's western suburbs. Her mother reported that Jane had planned to have lunch with her the next day. According to her mother, it was unusual for Jane to miss such plans, especially since she typically visited around that time to do her laundry as part of her routine. Jane's relatives spoke with police and described her as cheerful, sociable, and friendly. They said she enjoyed surfing and often went to the beach. Jane also loved children, which may explain why she chose to work for a child care services company after finishing school. Following her disappearance, police searched her home for clues, but found nothing significant. Eventually, local authorities established a special task force called the Macro Police to investigate both cases. The first involved the mysterious disappearance of Sarah Spears. Then, more than 50 days after Jane went missing, her remains were discovered by local residents picking wildflowers about 40 kilometers from where she was believed to have been abducted. The body was only partially covered by branches likely torn from a nearby tree. Reports indicated that Jane had a neck wound and several superficial injuries on her wrists. At this point, Sarah was still missing. Then, in the early morning of March 15, 1997, a 27-year-old lawyer named Kiara Glennon also disappeared. The day before, she had been vacationing with friends at the Continental Hotel, but decided to return home earlier than the rest. 3 men near a bus stop reported seeing Kiara around 12:30 a.m. They noticed her walking south along the Sterling Highway, talking to a man who was driving beside her in a car. Just weeks earlier, Kiara had celebrated her 27th birthday after returning from a year-long trip around the world. Back in Australia, she was living with her family. Kiara was born in Zambia, but her parents of Irish descent had moved to Perth when she was young. She studied ballet passionately into adulthood. In 1992, she graduated from the University of Western Australia with degrees in law and Japanese. Soon after, she completed an internship at a major law firm where she continued to work until her disappearance. Relatives and friends of Chiara described her as energetic, resourceful, persistent, and strong-willed, with a wonderful sense of humor. After her disappearance, law enforcement agencies began to suspect the involvement of a serial killer. The Western Australian state government offered a $250,000 reward for information leading to the identification of the perpetrator, at the time the largest reward ever offered in the country. Meanwhile, detectives searched Chiara's room for evidence, but most of the items they found were related to her sister's upcoming wedding. 19 days after Chiara's disappearance on April 3, 1997, her body was discovered by accident in a park several kilometers from where she was believed to have been abducted. Similar to Jane, Chiara had a knife wound in her neck, and her body was partially covered with branches. Notably, both murders occurred while Edwards was in a relationship with his future partner, a woman who had a 3-year-old daughter. He met her in April 1997 when he visited her workplace to repair wiring damaged by a lightning strike. Edwards surprised those around him by professing his love for his new girlfriend just 1 month after they met. From that point on, their relationship developed quickly. In a home video later obtained by authorities, Edwards appeared joyful as he played tennis with his young stepdaughter, offering her helpful advice during the game. It was also reported that he frequently organized picnics in parks, hosted guests, and lived an otherwise seemingly normal life. According to his new partner, the infidelity of his previous girlfriend may have deeply hurt him. The police initially focused their investigation on taxi drivers for several reasons. First, the victims were last seen attempting to use taxi services, which seemed to support this theory. Second, witnesses had reported seeing a car near the locations where the abductions occurred, suggesting a possible link. Despite conducting extensive DNA and fingerprint testing on numerous taxi drivers, these efforts yielded no results. By April of the following year, investigators had identified a primary suspect, a 40-year-old civil servant named Lance Williams, who was frequently seen driving around the areas where the abductions took place. However, after prolonged surveillance and questioning, Lance never confessed to any involvement. By 2008, following numerous interrogations, authorities concluded that he was no longer a suspect. Another person initially considered a suspect was Bradley Murdoch, but he was also ruled out. Interestingly, at the height of the investigation, a special task force comprising over 100 police officers from various departments was involved. Despite its size, the task force failed to produce significant results and was eventually almost completely disbanded. Afterward, the department responsible for investigating serious crimes took over the case. The first major breakthrough came in 2009 when a DNA match was found. Forensic officer George Payton and senior researcher Lowry Webb managed to extract DNA from the decomposed remains of Chiara and sent the sample to the UK for testing. Although similar tests had been conducted previously in Australia and New Zealand, they had not produced any conclusive findings. The turning point came when a UK laboratory used a special testing technique unavailable in Australia. This technique could produce results from even the smallest tissue samples. Later, specialists in Australia compared the newly extracted DNA to their database and found a match with DNA from a 1995 assault on a 17-year-old girl in a city cemetery. This discovery led authorities to conclude that all of the crimes were committed by the same individual. However, it wasn't until 2015 that the full picture began to emerge. Police confirmed the connection between the 1995 cemetery assault, the murders of Jane and Chiara, and an earlier attack on an 18-year-old girl in her own bedroom in 1988. During that earlier crime, Edwards had accidentally left behind a nightgown containing his biological material. In the early morning of December 23, 2016, officers from the Western Australia State Police Tactical Response Unit entered the home of Bradley Edwards and arrested him. When they handcuffed him, his first reaction was, "What the hell is going on here?" The officers quickly informed him that he was a suspect in the Claremont serial killer case. In disbelief, he responded, "You've got to be kidding." As they read him his rights, he expressed confusion about why they believed he was connected to the case. Up to that point, Edwards had led what appeared to be a quiet and calm life. His social media profiles showed that he and his common-law wife were active volunteers, and he had even received a city award for community service. He had crafted the image of a normal, upstanding citizen, but whether that image reflected reality was another matter entirely. The following day, Edwards was formally charged and taken into custody. The charges included aggravated murder, kidnapping, indecent exposure, and sexual assault. Meanwhile, police began an extensive search of the house where Edwards had lived for several years. The evidence found in the garage was so disturbing that much of it could not be presented in a public trial. This included illegal pornographic material, homemade sex toys bags containing his genetic material sealed with hair ties, and a large collection of women's underwear designed with openings for male genitalia. One particularly notable discovery was a series of disturbing documents or stories. The first was titled, "The Story of Chloe," followed by Sophie and Nicole. All the stories shared a common theme, a man kidnapping his victims. It remained unclear whether Edwards had written these himself or downloaded them from the internet. In late October 2019, Edwards pleaded guilty to 5 out of the 8 charges against him. However, he denied the murder charges, claiming he had no involvement in the killings. The main trial, led by Chief Justice Stephen Hall, began on November 25, 2019 at the prosecution's request. Due to the significant public interest and the vast amount of complex evidence, the trial was conducted without a jury. Approximately 240 witnesses testified over the course of the 7-month trial. Throughout the proceedings, Edwards remained silent and refused to comment. He also declined to undergo a psychiatric evaluation, which could have offered insight into his motives for the crimes. One of the most critical pieces of evidence came from fabric fibers found on the victims' bodies. In total, 98 fibers were collected. Most matched the polypropylene fibers from the work uniform worn by Edwards. These uniforms were custom-made for his employer and were not commercially available. Additionally, fibers were discovered in Ciara's hair that matched the composition and color of the carpet in Edwards's work vehicle. A Holden Commodore executive station wagon, marked with the Telstra company logo as a telecommunications technician. Edwards frequently used this vehicle, including outside of work hours. Several witnesses, including a cemetery security guard, reported seeing this van parked near the cemetery, without any apparent reason, confirming that it was the same car used by Edwards during the abductions. Authorities had previously narrowed down their list of suspects, using sightings of this relatively uncommon vehicle, but they had been hindered by a lack of key evidence, specifically the suspect's DNA. By September 2020, Edwards was convicted of the murders of Jane Rimmer and Ciara Glennon. However, he was found not guilty of the murder of Sarah Spears, and no conviction was made in her case. Sentencing was initially scheduled for December of the same year. Around that time, a woman who had survived an attack in her bedroom in 1988 testified in court. She explained that she did not see herself as a victim because she had survived. However, she admitted that ever since the assault, She had lived with a persistent fear, especially at night, worrying that someone might attack her again while she slept. The woman testified in court that she had been experiencing seizures, panic attacks, and sudden anxiety for a long time, and that her mental health continued to deteriorate. Another victim who was kidnapped by Edwards and assaulted in a cemetery stated that he had robbed her of her youth. She found it difficult to articulate the profound and lasting impact that the horrific experience had on her life. A third victim, who had been assaulted in a city hospital, learned of Edwards's arrest when law enforcement contacted her. They informed her that the man who had attacked her was a serial killer, news that left her in shock. However, unlike many other victims, she was able to speak publicly about her experience and even wrote a book about it. The partner of Edwards's first common-law wife also commented on the arrest, though he chose to remain anonymous. He admitted that due to recent events, he now questioned whether he was truly the biological father of his daughter. Edwards's second partner also testified in court. She revealed that she began to doubt Edwards's honesty in the early 2000s, which led her to check his bank accounts. She discovered that he was withdrawing between $300 and $400 every few days. This was especially concerning because they lived modestly and often faced financial difficulties. Meanwhile, Edwards' family defended him staunchly. His nephew Adam Edwards described him as generous, straightforward, and approachable, insisting that he could not possibly be a serial killer. On December 23, 2020, Bradley Robert Edwards was sentenced to life in prison with a non-parole period of 40 years. This sentence was unprecedented and marked the longest ever imposed in Western Australia's history. When Supreme Court Justice Stephen Hall announced the verdict, applause broke out in the courtroom. The judge noted that although aggravating factors were present in each crime, there was insufficient evidence to conclude that Edwards posed an ongoing threat to society. Interestingly, Edwards's legal team had until February 3, 2021 to file an appeal and argue for his innocence, but they never did. The local police commissioner told news agencies that the court had successfully imprisoned one of the country's most dangerous criminals. He expressed hope that Edwards would spend the rest of his life behind bars without any possibility of release. He also reaffirmed his commitment to seeking justice for another victim, Sarah Spears. The case against Edwards is regarded as one of the most expensive and protracted criminal trials in Western Australia. By September 2020, the total cost had exceeded $11 million. Authorities also had to allocate substantial funds to provide court-mandated defense services for the accused. Significant resources were also dedicated to the prosecution, which included 4 prosecutors and 5 state lawyers. Some expert witnesses even traveled to Australia from overseas. The prosecution compiled over 150 volumes of documents, including detailed reports and carefully organized evidence of Edwards's crimes. Law enforcement also developed a comprehensive digital database containing thousands of gigabytes of case material. Civilians contributed as well, among them journalist Liam Bartlett, who conducted his own investigations. He believes that Edwards may have had many more victims. One potential victim was a 22-year-old woman named Julie Cutler, who vanished without a trace in June 1988 after leaving a hotel. Other young women also disappeared under similar circumstances, though little information is currently available about those cases. The conclusion of the Bradley Robert Edwards case. The Claremont serial killings left a deep scar on Western Australia's criminal history. Thanks to the tireless efforts of forensic investigators, researchers, law enforcement, and members of the public, justice was finally served for at least some of the victims, Edwards, who was found guilty of the brutal murders of Jane Rimmer and Ciara Glennon, was sentenced to life imprisonment. However, there are still victims who have yet to receive justice. This case serves as a stark reminder of the importance of upholding the law and continuing to work tirelessly to prevent similar crimes in the future.